Okay guys, so we got a Dodge 3500 here. Now we're going to do the brakes on it, brake pads in the front. It is a very simple process, and most of these are very common for a lot of different years. This is probably the only thing different, I would say 92 to 2004. Anything older, instead of the Allen wrench in the caliper, it's probably going to have a 9/16 bolt, and anything newer is going to have a T50 star probably. So other than that, everything's pretty much common on these, on the brake shoes, extremely common. So let's go ahead and pull off the tire. I just started pulling a couple of bolts and I remembered I wanted to make a video of it. I'm going to show you a way to do this without having to bleed your brakes as well. So let's get the tire off. Okay, so we got the tire off there. So, and I got a light up under there so you can see better. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to pop the top off the master cylinder, the lid. You can see how full this master cylinder is, and that's going to get fuller because we're going to move the fluid back in there from the caliper. So here's what you're going to need. I grabbed a 180 grit piece of sandpaper. I had an old piece off of the electric sander, and so we're going to use that. We've got some brake cleaner here. We've got a C-clamp. We've got a 3/8 Allen wrench, and any size wrench. This is just going to be for prying purposes if needed. We may not need it to take it off, but to put it back on, we want to snug it up tight, so get a wrench. It doesn't matter what size. And if you've seen any of my videos, you know how to lock those together. I'm going to make another video of how to remove this rotor. There's a little bit of a process to it because this extension's got to come out. All 8 of these 7/8 nuts have to come off. The center nut will have to come off with the cotter key, and that is an 1 3/4 inch. But of course you'll get that after you pull this. But anyway, that video will be there if you need that video. This particular rotor is not in bad shape. The other one's shot. So we're not going to change this rotor. We did get 2 of them. We're going to take one of them back, get a credit on that because we don't have to have it. So let's start off with this caliper. So you're going to take your 3/8 Allen, and right back here on the top by this brake line, let me get a good view so you know where we're going. Here's the master cylinder. Here's the bleeder valve. Again, we're not going to bleed it today. We won't need to. Right there is the 3/8 Allen bolt. And there's going to be another one directly underneath, right there. So let's go ahead and pull those back off. If you have to, go ahead and tap right in here with a hammer, anywhere across the top here where it separates, and the caliper will fold down. Okay, so our rotor pulled right down. We're going to snap those shoes out of there. Now here's where the sandpaper is going to come in. You can see this is just a little bit roughed up a little bit. There's a little bit of rust in there too. Make sure you use 180 grit or something finer, and just kind of sand around that a little bit. Do not use the grinder wheel here. Just rough it up a little bit is all you're going to do. And once you get that cleaned up, you're going to hit it with some brake cleaner. So we'll scratch that a little bit. You see this ring right here, right around the edge? That's where they turn it. If this has been turned before, you're going to see that ring. Let me get sideways here so you can see it better. So when they turn it, they cut all this metal up to there, and they leave that little lip so that you know that this has been turned before. That allows the next person to know whether they can turn it or not, again, because of the thickness of the rotor. So a lot of times you don't have to mic it to find out if it's been turned. A lot of them are just rated to turn once, rated to turn twice, and this is how they determine that. So if you ever see it smooth all the way across, it's because somebody didn't know what they were doing when they turned it, or it hasn't been turned. So let's start off by getting these brakes out. The shoes just pop right out. So go ahead and pull this one out. Leave the back one in there because this is where our little trick's going to come in, where we don't have to bleed it. Okay, in order to get those off, I just stick the Allen wrench right behind that lip and just pop, and it just comes right off, so no problem there. Now, here's our caliper, and this is where the trick comes in. We're taking this cylinder and we're going to move that back inside the caliper. By doing that, it's going to force the fluid through the line. We have not disconnected the line. We're going to leave it hooked up, and that's going to put the fluid back in that chamber, and that's the reason that we leave that lid off. Now, when you crank this down, just crank it down kind of slow and evenly, and just let the fluid go back into the master cylinder where you want it to go. Don't squeeze it too hard because you'll just overflow it and lose your fluid and have to add fluid. You do it this way. If it was topped off in the beginning when the new brakes were put on prior, you should have the same amount of fluid. No problems there, and we won't have to bleed it because we're not forcing any air into the system either way. We're just pushing the fluid back into the master cylinder. Okay, now that we have that squeezed down, we can remove the clamp. Pull the old shoe off. Now you can see how that caliper, the cylinder inside the caliper, has moved back down. And the reason that we don't use the clamp just like this without the shoe, there's two reasons. One, you don't have to thread it so far, but two, the main reason is that if this caliper is old, these things here can get rusted through just a little bit if there's any moisture in there, and there shouldn't be, but I have seen it. And when you push down on this cylinder here, trying to ram it all down, you can poke a hole right through there, and then you're rebuilding it, or if it's one that you can't find parts for, you're purchasing a new one. So now you can see that level has gone way up. All of our fluid is back up in here, and at this point, there's no reason to bleed the brakes. So we'll put the lid back on, and now there's going to be a process that you are going to hit the brakes after the job is done. And we'll go over that in just a moment. So we'll get that lid put back on, come back down here, and we're going to put the shoes on, the new shoes in the caliper. Now when you purchased your new shoes, you probably noticed there was a little tiny packet of grease in there. It's like a lube. Sometimes there isn't. And here's the reason why. Right up underneath these tabs, they like to vibrate and cause a squeaking noise. And it squeaks all the time, whether or not, right here on this side and under these tabs. Whether or not you're applying the brakes or not, it squeaks all the time. If you come across that, the reason is because there is no lube underneath these two locations or on these two locations. And it doesn't take much. All you need is just a little bit on your finger and just barely touch it right there and right there. And keep it off of the shoe itself, because obviously if it's on the other side, you're going to have an issue with the brake not stopping. So we've applied that underneath there. That's going to keep it from squealing all the time. Now, if it only squeals when you're applying the brakes, if you look on this shoe, there's a tab right there. That tab is further out than the thickness of this metal, but it's also into the meat of the asbestos of the brake. So when the brake lining goes past that point, before it gets metal to metal and ruins your rotor, you'll hear a screeching sound every time you hit the brakes. That's because this metal tab is rubbing up against the rotor up in here. So when that happens, then you know I need to change my brakes before I ruin my rotors. If you hit the brakes and you hear the squealing and it's continuous and you don't change your brakes, you're going to be changing the rotor like we're going to be doing on the other side of this vehicle. So pay attention to that. Again, if it's a squeak only when you hit the brakes, your brakes are bad and you need to change your brakes before you ruin the rotor. If you're hearing a screeching all the time, then it's this vibration here, and whoever changed the brakes didn't lube that up a little bit. So now you know. Alright, so at this point, right before we put these on, we're going to hit this entire area with brake cleaner. We're going to spray the caliper really good, we're going to spray the rotor really good, and that's what the rag's for, to catch it. A little bit of brake clean goes a long way. Okay, so I've cleaned it up with some brake clean. I cleaned all around the caliper. It's already starting to dry. Just sprayed it really good. I like to use a can on each side. It's your choice. A half a can is probably okay. But for the cost, it's so quick, so easy, and you can watch it as it dries. It dries so fast, it just takes a second. It sprays off all that gunk. And anytime that you're working here, we've touched the grease with the brakes already. You've seen that because we had to lube it. If you touch that rotor with that, that's not going to come off. It's going to be there for a long time and cause issues down the road. In this particular case, even with a little bit of grease on your hands from touching a ball joint or anything like that while you're working. But in this particular case with this brake clean, you can see how quick it is drying. It literally cleans all that, just eats it up, drops it down there on the rag, and it just dries in no time. So my advice to you is definitely get a can of it at least, and use a half a can on each side when you do this process. So alrighty, we're ready to put those new shoes in the caliper. Okay, so the new shoes are going to slide just in the same way that the other ones came out. If you're not too sure, you can see how it's concave here, concurve here. It's just simply going to go in with the same angle as the caliper. So I don't think you'll get confused, but if you do. Now the back one next to the caliper where the cylinder is, that's the one that will grip sideways, and this one grips over top, and that's on any of these brakes. So pretty much all of these Dodges are the same. You'd be surprised in how common they are. Now the length, the width, the shape, those are a little bit different because you need more stopping power, so they'll be a little bit bigger for a bigger engine. Smaller engine will have a smaller brake shoe because it needs less stopping power. And I think you understand that. So we got those in. Let's go ahead and flip it around, stick it on our rotor, and put our 2 3/8 Allen screws or Allen bolts back in. Okay, so now you have that tightened up with the 3/8 Allen wrench. Here's where that extra wrench comes in that we talked about earlier. If you didn't have to use that to pull those 3/8 bolts off, definitely use it to put them on. So go ahead and set your Allen wrench back in there once you've tightened it as tight as you can. And if you've seen any of my other how-to videos, you'll know that I like using 2 wrenches locked together for extra leverage. So you're just going to lock them together like that and give them another quick snug and get it extremely tight. Okay, and here at this point, if you have anything left in your can, go ahead and hit it in the areas where you were leaning up against the rotor and stuff, and let all that drop off of there and give it a second to dry. So at this point, we're done. We've got the brakes on, we've moved the cylinder back, we've locked back in the Allen wrenches. All we have to do is put the tire back on. So you have your lid back on your master cylinder. After you get your tire back on, what you're going to do is get into the truck and push the brakes down 3 times extremely slow. That's going to force any extra air and move that fluid back to the cylinder where it needs to go and close those brakes from the caliper around the rotor back where they need to go. So after that, you're going to fire up the truck, and now you have a vacuum line from your intake to your brake booster. So you want to apply a little bit of air once again. At this point, when you start up the vehicle, car or truck, push the brakes down really slow 1 time. That's it, you're done. There's no bleeding, there's no nothing. You're completely done. So I hope this video helped you out. Please subscribe, click like if you like it, and do me a favor, click on my name underneath the video. You can check out all my other how-to videos. Thanks again. Have a great one.